Welcome back everyone to Bridge the Divide, where we examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how with education, rationality, and reason we can bridge the societal divides that they create. Today, we're taking a look at a video from the channel Sanctus, where the host, who is most definitely a Catholic, claims to be able to make the case that the position of atheism entails evil moral consequences. And now that our eyeballs have rolled back to their normal positions in our skulls, let's hear what he has to say.
When we look out into the modern world, we see a smorgasbord of conflicting moral systems. The leaders of nations cannot agree on what is the good, or essentially, what should everyone strive for.
This sentiment is actually something that I agree on, but I also recognize that it's a social circumstance entailed by the fact that moral distinctions are themselves subjective in nature. Per the philosophical razor Hume's guillotine, an ought cannot be derived from an is, meaning that one cannot logically conclude a moral statement, what one ought do, from purely factual statements, that which is. What connects these two concepts, the facts, to the moral conclusions within societies are ethical premises, those statements being about what is valuable or desirable. And for the most part, one of the founding features of societies are collective agreements upon what is valuable and desirable. Examples being human well-being and human flourishing. And yes, as our societies grow larger over time, encompassing more voices, more opinions, and more complex social interactions, trying to determine the most moral course of action in any potential given situation can become extremely difficult. But that doesn't entail that doing so is impossible. It just requires the collective agreement within the society to do any and all necessary work to accomplish it.
The greater good.
The greater good, precisely.
But what is the source of this division? Well, put simply, the source is that of atheism or secularism.
No, it's the fact that moral realism is not a thing that exists. And so moral subjectivism or moral relativism leaves us with the daunting social challenge of finding common ground that every single person can agree upon. The capacity of an individual to make what we call moral distinctions has nothing to do with whether or not they believe in the existence of a god. Your problem, Sanctus, is with the fact that there are other people who don't believe as you do and they can make moral distinctions that you personally don't agree with. And as hard as it may be for you to hear this, that you happen to have been convinced that a particular version of a god exists does not entail that you corner the market on morality.
Atheism is the denial or lack of belief in the existence of God.
Well, at least you got that part right. Now let's see if you also understand that that position is only concerned with that one single proposition, and as such does not logically entail that the individual hold to any other specific scientific or philosophical positions.
Many atheists reject universal or objective morality.
While there are some rare non-believers who will attempt to make a case for the truth of moral realism, it is pretty much understood within the realm of philosophy that there is no real way to rationally justify that claim. But it should also be understood that philosophical concepts such as the Euthyphro dilemma expose the reality that if you choose to define your God as being ultimate, meaning that nothing exists external of the God to act as a point of reference or a point of appeal for logical coherency or even its own mental content, then it's entailed that any moral distinctions it makes are entirely subjective, meaning that they are entirely dependent upon its own mind and stances. So yes, by the lights of your own worldview, moral relativism is confirmed. And just because in your worldview you've defined your God as being the big Billy badass of the universe, it doesn't entail that the moral distinctions it makes are suddenly mind stance independent.
And adopt a view of morality that is subjective. Subjective morality can be defined as a system of morality that is based on the subject, or the individual and his preferences, feelings, culture, etc.
The encompassing term for this is moral anti-realism, which is the meta-ethical position that mind stance independent facts and values don't exist, and as such, moral judgments are neither true nor false in the same way that factual statements about reality are. The kicker here, and the one that theists cannot overcome by appealing to any kind of a god entity, is that there exists no logical contradiction in moral anti-realism being the case. So any argument posed against it ultimately boils down to an appeal to emotion, specifically an appeal to consequences.
To give an example, those who hold to subjective morality may value sexual freedom, or they may not value it. It is dependent on the individual's preferences.
I noticed that you put up some stock imagery of an abortion rights rally at this point in the video, and I wanted to make sure that you knew that despite all of the hang-ups that Catholics tend to have about sex, the abortion access debate is really not so much about sexual freedom, because it's damn near universally about safeguarding the human right to bodily autonomy and necessary health care. A bit of advice for you: if you have to misrepresent the opposing position in order to give your own position more credence, then your position never had any credence to begin with.
David Hume explains it best when he states, "So that when you pronounce any action or character to be vicious, you mean nothing but that from the constitution of your nature you have a feeling or sentiment of blame from the contemplation of it. Vice and virtue, therefore, may be compared to sounds, colors, heat, and cold, which, according to modern philosophy, are not qualities in subjects, but perceptions in the mind."
Yes, I can hear you all right now. It is a dicey prospect when a theist tries to quote somebody. But fortunately, in this instance, I happen to be very familiar with this quote because it's taken directly from one of my favorite philosophical texts, specifically Scottish philosopher David Hume's philosophically legendary book, A Treatise of Human Nature. And I'm not being hyperbolic here. This particular text is considered to be one of Hume's greatest contributions to the field and is regarded as being one of the most influential works in the history of philosophy. And the quote that Sanctus happens to be using here actually comes from the back half of a much larger paragraph, in which Hume fully explains exactly how he came to the conclusion of moral anti-realism that is being expressed in this quote.
This is contrasted with objective or universal morality, which can be defined as a system of morality that is applicable to any person, culture, or society.
True, moral realism posits the existence of mind-stance-independent moral facts. The challenge from there is to explain exactly what it is that grounds such things as facts without itself being a mind with its own stances, which is precisely why such grounding cannot be a God entity.
To give an example, a person who holds to objective morality may uphold murder to always be wrong in every situation.
But you see, there's a problem there. Murder is a legal term that is defined as being the action of committing an unjustifiable homicide. In this context, the act itself is analytically immoral, meaning that it is immoral by definition. But the standards for what constitutes justification are entirely subjective to the individual or the society that is evaluating the action. So if it's determined due to any extenuating circumstances that the individual did possess justification, then that individual definitionally did not commit the act of murder, they committed the act of justifiable homicide. So now take this hypothetical into mind. If you were to commit the act of homicide and you fully did so believing that you had justification to do so, but after a careful analysis of the evidence, the society that you are in determines that you in fact did not have justification, then the ultimate determination would be that you did in fact commit murder, but that ultimate determination would not be in any kind of a mind stance independent sense. And that's because it is the agreed upon internal structure of the society that acts as the external referent that is informing the social stance being appealed to in order to make that determination. So, unless you are able to demonstrate that the act of homicide, sans any context of justification, is itself mind stance independently immoral, then you're always going to be appealing to a stance to justify the moral judgment.
Generally, those who uphold objective morality believe in God, and God being that being which gives this system of morality to mankind.
But given that by definition your God is both ultimate and has a mind, then any moral distinctions it makes are entirely subjective to it. The distinction here is best represented by the Euthyphro dilemma, which asks the question, is a thing good because God does it, or does God do it because it is good? On one side of the dilemma, you confirm moral relativism. If the God is defined as being ultimate, then any moral distinctions that it dictates reference only its own mind and stance. But on the other side of the dilemma, you actually confirm that your God is not ultimate by conceding that there are moral facts that even it itself must adhere to. However, as I stated before, in your theistic worldview, there is nothing that exists external of your God that acts as a point of reference or a point of appeal for mental content or coherency. Thus, Sanctus, you are merely grounding such moral distinctions as being objective because you have chosen to define your God as being the ultimate power and authority. But unfortunately for your worldview, that does not logically entail that such distinctions are mind stance independently true. So all you're really doing here is advocating for a might makes right scenario, which, by the way, if the subject in question here wasn't your God, you would probably agree is itself immoral.
Or put differently, constructs reality and human nature, such that they ought to act out or achieve certain goods and virtues and avoid those things which lack good or are evil.
The problem here, Sanctus, is that you are not answering the question good in reference to what exactly. What exactly is it in your worldview that determines why a thing is mind stance independently good, especially when there exists nothing external of your God to act as a reference that it itself did not create? Just saying a thing is good because your God does it or because your God has declared it to be so confirms moral relativism per the Euthyphro dilemma. And just saying that it is good because that is what God's nature is an uninformative tautology. God equals good equals God equals God. It doesn't actually tell us anything. You, Sanctus, being the one who is making the positive claim, are saddled with answering the question, what exactly is it that is external of your God that acts as the necessary referent to say that your God is good in any kind of a coherent sense? If such a thing does not exist, which by the way is indicated by your worldview, then ultimately you are just agreeing to moral relativism, but you're just presenting your position as being moral realism because you've been conditioned to be afraid of the concept of going to hell.
Of course, then, a lack of belief in God's existence generally leads to a lack of belief in objective or universal morality.
There are a handful of atheists out there that do make arguments for moral realism. Unfortunately for them, they're in the same boat as you. They're just not grounding their position in the existence of any kind of an agent, such as a god. And that's because they recognize the logical contradiction of trying to ground mind-independent statements in a mind.
But then there becomes an issue with the practicality of this belief. For if we grant that subjective morality is true, and objective morality isn't, then many absurd consequences result from this view.
But any potential issue of practicality does not logically entail that the position of moral anti-realism is false. Arguing against the position by appealing to the possibility of such issues is just an argument from consequences fallacy. And you just saying it's easier for everyone to just believe that a God exists, despite there being no rational justification to do so, and then the people need to uphold any subjective moral distinctions that other people are claiming that this entity is making as though they were objective, which itself is both begging the question and logically contradictory, and then they should just accept without any question that the ought here is predicated upon the promise of a heaven or the threat of a hell, which is just straight up emotional and psychological manipulation, does not in any way solve this issue, because in the end all you're doing is advocating for slavery because you've been convinced that your particular God is the all-powerful slave master.
Thus today we shall drive atheism to its logical conclusions regarding morality, purpose, and value.
There's that common issue again. The position of atheism does not logically entail holding to any specific scientific or philosophical positions. There are atheists out there that are moral realists. There are theists out there that are moral anti-realists. The positions are not mutually exclusive. And like I said before, that you personally don't like or agree with other meta-ethical positions does not logically entail that they are false.
What then are these absurd consequences that result from atheism's subjective morality?
Well, per the definition of absurd in this context, you'd have to be pointing out how a particular drawn conclusion is illogical in the face of the position. So what exactly are these illogical conclusions that you think the position of moral anti-realism is coming to? Because remember, being an atheist has nothing to do with this.
Well, for one, it is impossible to tell another person that they have done something wrong.
Flatly incorrect. Logical impossibility is indicated by the existence of a contradiction. A married bachelor or a square circle are examples of this. The position of moral anti-realism does hold that an individual cannot state that something is morally wrong in any kind of a mind stance independent sense, but it does hold that a thing can be stated to be wrong in a relativistic or subjective sense, such as in reference to something normative like the structure of a society. The problem here, Sanctus, is that you are front-loading this assertion with the notion that the position of moral anti-realism is itself a logical contradiction. But given that there exists no logical contradiction in moral distinctions being subjective, the only absurd conclusion here is the one that you just asserted.
For they are merely acting out their preferences, and by imposing your own preferences on another person, you attempt to make your preferences of morality the standard that all should follow.
All of this is covered by moral relativism. That you, Sanctus, don't like or agree with it is irrelevant. It doesn't make the conclusion false.
Thus, the most vilest of immoral actions become licit and acceptable.
That is a potential consequence, sure. Why do you think our species constantly goes to war with itself over this stuff? There's still no actual issue here.
For as was stated, one can't really tell another person that rationally their actions are wrong by appealing to some standard.
Actually, we can. It's called the legal system. And we're not stating that the distinctions that we make are mind-independently true here. We are stating that they are objectively true only in reference to what is subjectively agreed upon within the society. If the society collectively agrees on a set of goals, and you desire to remain a part of that society and enjoy its benefits, then you ought to comport your behavior in accordance with the expectations of the society, lest you swiftly find yourself no longer a part of it.
If the atheist is to be consistent with their position, this necessarily is the result.
What you actually mean is if the moral anti-realist is to be consistent with their position, then they can't claim that any moral distinction is mind stance independently true, which, because they are moral anti-realists, they don't. You seem to be attacking a problem here that you created just so you could attack it.
Interestingly, many atheists opt out for a system of utilitarianism, which attempts to have a society constructed on the idea of maximizing pleasure and getting rid of that which is opposed to pleasure.
It's really weird to frame utilitarianism as only seeking pleasure. I mean, sure, one could derive personal pleasure from securing the well-being of others, but that's not in any sense universal. Utilitarianism can denote pain and suffering for the security of the thing in question. But I get that what you're doing here, Sanctus, is framing the concept of personal preference, which itself is substantive to the discussion, by invoking the term pleasure as coded language to imply selfishness, which is not substantive to the discussion. In fact, not only is it not substantive, it's really just you trying to provide a reason to kill the argument in the eyes of your fellow believers. Because you know if you don't first misrepresent the opposing position, then you actually have no rational means by which you can show it to be false.
Now there are a couple issues with this system. For one, which pleasures that ought to be maximized are not necessarily agreed upon by all people. For what one person prefers or finds pleasure in, another may detest, in which case the majority rules on what is pleasurable.
Thus the existence of the justice systems that are established to secure and maintain the agreed upon standards of the society.
And we find a similar situation in 18th century America. For at one point the majority desired slavery as an institution that helps to maximize the overall amount of people in the society. But of course the issue with this view is that every human being has dignity and value. But in atheism's subjective worldview, they really have no basis for opposing slavery.
Firstly, and most obviously, agreed upon social systems do change over time, and the applied justice systems change to reflect that. Secondly, the position of atheism still has nothing to do with any of this. Regardless of whether or not we believe in the existence of a god, if our collectively agreed upon goal is to maximize well-being for individuals in the society, then we ought to conduct ourselves in a manner that maximizes that well-being. Slavery, the act of which demonstrably diminishes the well-being of the individual by reducing or eliminating civil liberties and bodily autonomy, then ought to be outlawed within the society. Ultimately, whether you ground that in a supernatural god concept, or if you ground it in our species' evolved naturalistic capacity for empathy, is irrelevant. The subjectively determined goal is agreed upon, thus the codes of acceptable behavior are agreed upon by the people. Should of course those people continue to decide to remain a part of the society and enjoy its benefits. And if they don't, they can either choose to leave the society altogether, or they can fight to try and change it to better reflect their subjective ideals. I seem to recall a particular war that was fought right here in America over that very thing, and while we can see how well that worked out for them, their defeat does not logically entail that the act of slavery is mind stance independently immoral. The act in and of itself in a vacuum is amoral, and it is we, the majority, that declares it to be immoral because the act itself runs counter to the social goals that we have all collectively agreed upon as a society.
For morality is merely what one prefers.
This is still just an argument from consequences, meaning that it is not a defeater.
Another issue with this worldview is it amounts to saying that the purpose of life is self-pleasure.
While that could be an individual's conclusion, that conclusion is not logically entailed by the position itself. What is logically entailed by the position is that the purpose for any one individual's life is entirely self-determined. Whether that purpose the individual has chosen for themselves is functionally beneficial, neutral, or detrimental to the society is another question entirely.
But atheism not only rejects universal morality, but it rejects universal purpose.
Still not a logical defeater. If all the people within the society agree that individuals can determine the purpose for their own lives themselves, while simultaneously agreeing upon a collective purpose for the society itself, and that individual purposes should not countermand the collective goal, then your point becomes moot unless you yourself can demonstrate the existence of a source for mind-stance-independent moral statements.
Every person's purpose then is subjective, for one person may not care to maximize pleasure. They could be a depressed or pessimistic person who does not care or value these things.
Hence why society collectively agreed upon the necessity of funding the efforts of mental health and social support systems.
Now, going back to subjective morality and atheism, while also applying this idea of subjective purpose, we find a very sad issue. If there is no universal purpose, then we are left to create our own purpose.
All you're doing here, Sanctus, is pointing out things that are true about reality. You have yet to actually provide any kind of evidence or even argumentation for believing that objective moral distinctions exist. And we're going to go ahead and skip this section because it's just him whinging about things he personally doesn't like. He does, however, make this problematic statement.
Thus, atheism, if driven to its logical conclusion, leads to despair, destruction, and meaninglessness.
That right there is the same philosophically bankrupt evangelical propaganda that theists have been spreading for centuries. No, the position of atheism itself does not logically entail any of the things he mentioned here. So point blank, his assertion is just a non sequitur. Social issues such as a lack of access to healthcare, lack of necessary nutrition, lack of education, lack of social support systems, and extreme poverty are what lead to these very common issues. And if you'll notice, the statistics bear out that religiosity is highest in areas where the things that I just mentioned are systemic, but in areas where these vital aspects of society are duly accounted for by local and federal government, the overall individual and social need for religion rapidly declines. So Sanctus, not only is your theistic sentiment here philosophically bankrupt, it's also an abject denial of reality.
As was stated, this on its own doesn't disprove atheism being true, but it shows the reality of atheism's evil moral consequences.
And that statement was just all fucked up. While Sanctus, you are correct in stating that the logical possibility of the truth of moral anti-realism has nothing to do with people being atheists, given that atheism is an individual's position regarding one specific proposition. So for atheism to be true, all it takes is for the individual to not be convinced that the God proposition is true. You're just throwing out the word evil there to describe something that you subjectively don't agree with. You have yet to provide any argumentation or evidence to support your assertion,
which the majority of atheists are completely blind to.
No, we're not blind to it. We just don't agree with you on how or why you're applying that term.
Just think of how society will collapse over time, since secularism has infected world governments as well.
This is also patently false because there are many secular countries out there that are doing just fine. But as history has shown us, human society as a concept never really ceases to exist, but rather it endures in a constant state of change. Old systems are taken over, adopted, and co-opted by new systems. So long as there exist humans, there will exist human social systems. That it's possible that one version that you personally prefer can be overtaken by one that you don't is completely irrelevant.
But under atheism, none of this truly matters, for nothing matters in atheism.
Like I've said 100 times before, the position of atheism does not logically entail holding to any specific philosophical positions. The position of moral anti-realism would state that such things are not mind-stance independently true because they are mind-stance dependently true. And the position certainly doesn't state that such abstract distinctions don't exist at all or that they are somehow impossible.
As Pope Pius XII writes in his encyclical, Summi Pontificatus.
Oh, the irony! It's too much!
That in a discussion in which you, Sanctus, have taken the position that moral realism is true, you have now chosen to quote the Pope, who was openly criticized by the people for his silent consent of the Holocaust, is objectively hilarious. As indicated by his speeches during World War II, Pius XII never once explicitly condemned the actions of the Third Reich, nor did he call attention to the suffering of the millions they persecuted and slaughtered. It has long been acknowledged by historians that Pius XII prioritized the the church's power and position over moral leadership during the war. Essentially, in order to protect the church from the potential wrath of the Third Reich in the event that their global campaign was ultimately successful, which at the start of the war Pius firmly believed that they would be, he hedged the church's position by choosing to remain silent. And all of this was confirmed when a series of back-channel letters between Pius and the H-man's own administration were unsealed after the Vatican opened its confidential archives back in 2020. Suffice to say, there is a very valid reason why Pius XII is often referred to as Hitler's Pope. I can also tell you, Sanctus, that in the context of morality, quoting directly from a demonstrated moral hypocrite is probably one of the worst ways to try and undergird your position. So in the end, this guy presents exactly zero evidence to support his position of moral realism. And even though it wouldn't prove his position to be the case, he doesn't even provide any valid argumentation. He simply does what everyone else does when they're arguing for moral realism. He whinges about how much he doesn't like the opposing position, and then he completely misrepresents it in order to fabricate some form of justification as to why his is better. And while that tactic will never prove that moral realism is the case, he somehow still fails to realize that his very ability to do what he's doing here is exactly what we would expect to see if it were in fact moral relativism that was the case. The efforts to bridge the divide can be challenging here, as any chance for us to do so requires both sides to be intellectually honest by allowing themselves to be open to information that could potentially contradict their position. And that unfortunately is just something that one cannot force someone to be. Horses and water and all that. So the best way that we can work towards accomplishing that task is by setting the example. By openly allowing ourselves access to data that is pertinent to the other person, and then taking the time to patiently incorporate that data into our own worldviews for a critical analysis, we can demonstrate through our actions that we can certainly make progress towards establishing common ground. Whether that be in the form of collective action towards a particular goal, or merely just a reduction in overall social tension, both are equally beneficial to the individual and the society as we move forward into the future together. But even if the individual on the other side of the conversation is unwilling to agree to that standard, there still exists innumerable minds surrounding the conversation that may themselves be able to benefit from the existence of the discourse. And so long as expressions of speech remain free, we will always have the opportunity to find the means to bridge these ultimately unnecessary social divisions that exist between us. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month. A link to where you can support these important efforts is down in the description. And if you like what you saw here and would like to support this channel further, links to channel membership and to my merch store are down in the description below. Once again, a massive thank you to each and every one of you for your continued support, and as always, be safe, be excellent to each other, and together we can bridge the divide.